Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
I never believed in the supernatural. As a nurse, I was a woman of science, skeptical of anything I couldn't see, touch, or measure. But everything changed when I was assigned to room 13 in the old wing of the hospital. It wasn't a prestigious position, just a small, cramped room down the hall from the ER. I'd heard the rumors about it, of course. Everyone who had worked there seemed to leave with a nervous glance or a quiet word about strange happenings. I figured it was just superstition, a mix of exhaustion, and a long history of a hospital that had seen more than its fair share of death and trauma. The hospital was built back in the early 1900s, and its ancient halls creaked like they held secrets, but I never took any of that seriously. The first day in room 13, I didn't think much of it. The room was tidy. A basic examination table against one wall, a small desk covered with papers. Everything seemed normal enough, save for one thing. As soon as I closed the door behind me, I caught a whiff of something strange. It wasn't overpowering, but it was unmistakable. The smell was sulfur, like rotten eggs, thick and lingering in the air. I thought it was a fluke. Maybe it was just an old ventilation system or some chemical smell from cleaning supplies. I opened the window, hoping the breeze would clear it out, but it wouldn't go away. By the end of the day, I could still smell it faintly, even with the window wide open. The smell stuck to my skin and clothes as if it had soaked into everything. The air was cold, too. That was the first thing I noticed every morning when I stepped into the room. No matter what the temperature was outside, the room had a chill to it, like stepping into a cave. I checked the thermostat, but it was fine. No drafts, nothing wrong with the air conditioning, yet the cold stayed, creeping through my bones. I tried to focus on my work, but something felt off. Every time I was alone in that room, I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia, at least not at first. It was more like an oppressive presence that lingered, like something was just outside my field of vision, waiting for me to acknowledge it. It wasn't until a week later that one of the senior nurses, Patricia, took me aside and asked how I was settling in. When I told her it was fine, she gave me a tight-lipped smile. "Room 13, huh?" she said, lowering her voice. "Well, if you start feeling strange, just don't push it, trust me." I thought she was just being superstitious, but her words stuck with me. Over the next few days, I began to hear more stories. Some staff said they'd seen things. Objects moving on their own, the feeling of cold hands brushing their skin in the middle of the night, faint whispers that would echo down the empty hallways. They all dismissed it as their imagination, but everyone agreed that room 13 was different. One night, I stayed late to catch up on paperwork. As I sat at my desk, scribbling notes, I thought I heard a rustle behind me. When I turned around, nothing was there. Just the empty examination table and the shelves of files. I went back to my work, shaking it off. But then it happened again, the rustling, followed by a soft scraping sound like something dragging across the floor. I stood up quickly, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. I checked the desk for anything that could have fallen. Nothing. But the air was heavier now, thicker, like the room was trying to suffocate me. I felt the presence again, closer this time, and the sulfur scent filled my nostrils so strongly that I gagged. I opened the window, desperate for fresh air, but it did nothing. The cold lingered, and the whispers seemed to grow louder, as if the room itself was breathing. The next morning, I was drained, exhausted in a way that didn't make sense. I had barely slept, my body aching as if I hadn't rested at all. When I reported the strange occurrences to my supervisor, he only nodded, his face pale. "Room 13 has a reputation," he said. "We've had issues with it before. Just try to push through it, okay?" I didn't want to sound like a fool, so I did my best to ignore it. But as days passed, things only got worse. One evening, I walked into the room to find the files on my desk scattered across the floor. It was as if someone had thrown them in a fit of rage. I bent down to pick them up, and as I touched one of the papers, a A cold shot through my fingers, sharp as ice. I stumbled back, heart racing, and when I looked at my hand, it was covered in goosebumps, as if I had been holding something frozen. I tried to brush it off, but that sensation of being watched never left. It was suffocating. Weeks later, I finally confided in Patricia again. She looked at me with pity, her eyes reflecting something I hadn't seen before: fear. "You're not the first one," she whispered. "Everyone who's worked in that room has felt it. The smell, the cold. It's like something's in there, something that doesn't belong." It wasn't long before I started feeling sick. I couldn't sleep. When I did sleep, it was plagued by nightmares. Visions of dark shapes moving around me, cold hands clasping my throat, and an overwhelming sense of dread. I felt like I was being drained, like my energy was slipping away every time I set foot in that room. I tried to fight it. I tried to keep up my usual routine. But the physical and mental toll was too much. I was exhausted. I couldn't think straight. My colleagues noticed too. They started commenting on my appearance, how pale I looked, how thin I had become. I had trouble focusing, and I felt like I was barely holding myself together. One day, after a particularly terrifying night, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to my supervisor and asked for a transfer. I didn't give any details, just told him I couldn't work there any longer. To my surprise, he didn't hesitate. "I thought you'd say that," he said, his voice low. "You're moving to room 14 next door." The moment I left room 13, I felt the weight lift off my chest. The chill in my bones disappeared. I slept for the first time in weeks, and the nightmares stopped. The sulfur smell faded, and I began to feel like myself again. But the story didn't end there. A new nurse was assigned to room 13 soon after. I didn't tell her what I'd experienced. I didn't want to be the one to spook her. It was her choice to make. A few months later, she requested a transfer. Same as me. She didn't last long. The same strange occurrences, cold air, sulfur, that oppressive feeling followed her out of that room, and she couldn't shake it. Now, room 13 remains vacant most of the time. Doctors come and go, but none of them stay. The staff knows what's going on, but no one talks about it openly. The hospital doesn't acknowledge the rumors, but they don't need to. We all know the truth. Something in that room isn't natural, something that defies explanation. I've been in that hospital for years now, but I'll never forget room 13. Every time I pass by, a chill runs down my spine. I can't explain it, and I don't try to anymore. All I know is that there are things in this world that don't follow the rules, and room 13 is one of them. It was supposed to be just another typical shift at Redwood Hospital, a sprawling medical center nestled on the outskirts of a city always alive with sound. The kind of place where life seemed to ebb and flow in an endless cycle. Patients coming in, families whispering hopes and fears, the hum of machines, and the ceaseless buzz of nurses and doctors moving quickly, faces tired but professional. The hospital had seen its share of miracles and tragedies, each one marking the walls with the invisible weight of unspoken stories. But it wasn't until one fateful night that everything began to change. Her name was Emily Thompson. She came in late, her face twisted in pain, clutching her stomach as if it might fall apart at any moment. Her husband Daniel rushed her through the doors, nearly frantic. "Please help her," he cried, his voice cracking with desperation. She was giving birth far too early, and the doctors, though skilled, were already worried. The delivery started as complicated but manageable, until it turned into a nightmare. The operating room became a frenzy of frantic movement, but Emily's body just couldn't keep up. She died before the morning sun had even touched the sky. The baby, too, was born still, silent. There were no joyous cries, no warm embrace, just a suffocating silence that seemed to linger over the room like a dark cloud. From that moment on, Redwood Hospital would never be the same. At first, it was only whispers. Nurses working the night shift would look at the hallways leading to the maternity ward and feel something unsettling in the air, a coldness that didn't belong. Some of them mentioned it in passing, but others simply shrugged it off, blaming exhaustion. After all, they'd been working long hours, and who wouldn't be a little on edge in a place as busy as this? But then things started to get stranger. A nurse slipped one night while walking through a corridor near the maternity ward. There was no spill, no wet floor to explain her fall. She just collapsed, her ankle snapping with a sickening crack. When she was asked what had happened, she could only say she'd felt an intense chill, like someone had breathed cold air down her neck. It was dismissed as just another accident, until it wasn't. A few days later, Dr. Harris, one of the surgeons who had been present during Emily's delivery, began acting strangely. Midway through a routine surgery, he froze, his hands trembling uncontrollably as he dropped his instruments with a loud clatter. His face drained of color. When he was escorted from the room, he could barely speak. The only thing he could mutter was that he had seen something in the reflection of the glass, something that wasn't supposed to be there, a figure standing still, watching him. The weeks that followed were a slow descent into unease. Small things started happening. Lights flickered, equipment malfunctioned without explanation. Objects fell off shelves for no reason at all, but it was the presence. The strange sensation that seemed to hover around the maternity ward, that truly unsettled everyone. Some nurses reported seeing a figure standing in the hallway, just out of sight, always just around the corner, never fully visible. Others said they'd seen the figure up close, a pale shape in a hospital gown, wandering aimlessly as though searching for something lost. And then, the most terrifying thing happened. One night, after a power outage that left the maternity ward in complete darkness, several staff members claimed they saw Emily's figure more clearly than ever before. In the pitch-black silence, she stood at the end of the hall, her posture stiff and unnatural. Those who crossed her path described an overwhelming feeling of dread, a hollow emptiness that seemed to seep into their very bones. There was no comforting warmth of life, just the cold, heartbreaking emptiness of a mother searching for her child. It was clear now. Emily's presence was not a fleeting sensation. She was here, haunting the place where she had lost everything. But it didn't end there. Doors would jam inexplicably. Alarms on incubators would go off in the middle of the night, even when the babies inside were perfectly fine. The slow, deliberate sound of footsteps echoed through the empty hallways, the kind of steps that made your heart race with fear, even if you didn't see anyone walking. The staff knew they couldn't ignore it anymore. A small group of nurses decided to investigate. They combed through old records, digging into the tragic night of Emily's death. What they uncovered was even more horrifying. Due to a clerical error, Emily's baby had never been sent to the morgue with her. Instead, it had been mistakenly sent to another part of the hospital, incinerated before anyone could even realize what had happened. Emily never got the chance to say goodbye. Devastated by this revelation, the nurses decided to try and make things right, to offer some kind of closure. That night, under the cover of darkness, they held a small, quiet ceremony in the morgue. A doll was placed in a tiny cradle, symbolizing the baby Emily had lost. It was meant as a tribute, a way to honor the child that had never been given a proper farewell. The next day, things began to calm down. The strange occurrences, the flickering lights, the unsettling presence, everything seemed to subside. But the staff knew better. Though Emily's figure no longer appeared as often, her presence still lingered in the air, like a cold, unshakable weight. And even now, when I walk through the maternity ward, I sometimes feel it, an icy chill brushing past my skin, like the faintest whisper of a mother's grief. Some say that she's still here, watching over the hospital, mourning the child she was never able to hold. No one knows for sure, but every time the lights flicker or the silence stretches too long, I can't help but wonder if Emily's sorrow has truly found peace. I never imagined that my job as a perinatal pathologist would lead me to confront something far beyond the scope of science, something that made me question everything I thought I knew about life and death. Until then, my work had been purely clinical, studying fetal and neonatal deaths, searching for answers, helping families understand what went wrong. It was a demanding but rewarding career. I found comfort in the methodical nature of the work, in the certainty that with each case, I was uncovering the truth. But everything changed when I was sent to St. Augustine's Hospital, a seemingly routine assignment. The hospital had been grappling with an inexplicable surge in perinatal deaths, and they needed a specialist to investigate. I accepted the transfer immediately, confident I could help. The hospital was modern and well-equipped, with a competent staff, but from the very moment I stepped inside, something felt off. It wasn't just the sterile scent of antiseptic that lingered in the air, or the low hum of machines working tirelessly. It was something in the atmosphere, a heaviness that I couldn't place. The morgue, where I would be spending most of my time, was tucked away in the basement, far from the bustle of the main hospital. I had worked in morgues before, but this one was different. It was isolated, cold, and unnervingly quiet. The lights were dim, casting long shadows on the white walls, and despite the hospital's modern design, the morgue had an old, almost forgotten feel to it. I couldn't shake the sense that the place was hiding something dark. Then the first time I saw her, everything changed. I was in the autopsy room, examining the body of a fetus, when I glanced up and saw a figure standing in the farthest corner. A woman. She was dressed in a simple white dress that seemed out of place in the sterile environment of the morgue. Her dark hair covered her face, but I could see her shoulders trembling slightly. It was clear she was crying, though no sound came from her. I blinked, trying to clear the image from my eyes, but she was still there, unmoving. My scientific mind immediately dismissed it as a trick of the light, or perhaps exhaustion after a long day, but the figure didn't disappear. In the days that followed, it became a pattern. Each new case I worked on was more confusing than the last. The same lack of cause, the same eerie silence in the morgue, and always the woman in the corner, weeping. She never said a word, but I felt her presence more and more, as though she was connected to the deaths, tied to something that I couldn't yet understand. I kept my encounters to myself, afraid that my colleagues might think I was losing my grip on reality. But I knew what I was seeing was real, even if I couldn't explain it. Eventually, I began to dig into the hospital's history, desperate for answers. What I found made my blood run cold. St. Augustine's had been built on the grounds of an orphanage that had operated in the early 1900s. The records told a horrific tale. Children had died in droves, many from neglect, untreated illnesses, and the cruel conditions they were forced to endure. The orphanage had been shut down after a scandal, but it seemed the suffering that had taken place there still lingered, embedded in the very soil and stone of the hospital. I couldn't help but connect the dots. The deaths, the woman, her sorrow. It all seemed to point to something far beyond my understanding. Was she a manifestation of the pain and loss that had accumulated over the years? A spirit bound to the hospital, forever mourning the children who had never had a chance to live? Or was she something else? A symbol of something far darker, a warning of the cost of neglect and cruelty. Though I eventually moved to another hospital, I never truly left St. Augustine's behind. I couldn't stop thinking about her, the woman in the corner, and the lives she seemed to mourn. Was she still there, still crying for the lost children? Was she forever bound to the hospital, unable to find peace? Even now, in the quiet of my new office, I often find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing there, her eyes filled with sorrow. I wonder if I will ever truly escape the haunting memory of that place, or if the grief she carried will follow me wherever I go. It's a reminder always of the fragility of life and the unrelenting grip of grief that can tie us to the past, even when we least expect it. I've never been one for superstition. My world was grounded in facts, data, and medicine. As a nurse, I trusted what I could see, hear, and measure. But everything changed when I was assigned to an old hospital wing, and to one particular room, room 12. It wasn't exactly a prestigious job. It was a cramped room in the corner of a forgotten section of the hospital. I'd heard whispers about it from other staff members. You know, the usual rumors, flickering lights, cold spots, strange noises in the night. Most of it, I assumed, was just tired people letting their imaginations run wild after long shifts. The hospital was old, built in the 1930s with creaky floors and narrow hallways, but I wasn't afraid. Or at least I told myself I wasn't. The first day I stepped into room 12, nothing felt off. The space was small, nothing special, just an exam table in the corner and a few cabinets. But as soon as I closed the door behind me, I noticed something. A faint but unmistakable scent lingered in the air. It was sulphurous, like the smell of rotten eggs. I tried to dismiss it as a fluke, maybe an old air conditioning unit or cleaning chemicals, but it was persistent. The smell clung to the room, clung to me, even when I opened the window to let in the fresh air. It didn't go away. The room also had a chill. It didn't matter if it was hot outside or if the other rooms were warm. The cold in room 12 was constant, biting like a shadow that refused to leave. I checked the thermostat. It was fine, no drafts. The air conditioning worked just fine. Still, every time I entered, the cold wrapped itself around me, seeping into my skin. But what was even stranger was the feeling. At first it was subtle, almost unnoticeable, like someone was watching me, but there was no one there. A sense of unease settled in, but I pushed it aside. Maybe I was just tired. After all, the hospital was always busy, and the work could be grueling. But the longer I stayed, the stronger the sensation became. It was like the room itself was aware of me, breathing with me, existing in a way that shouldn't have been possible. A few days in, I bumped into Ella, one of the senior nurses. She seemed different. There was something about her eyes, a wariness, when she asked how I was settling in. I told her it was fine. She gave me a tight smile and said, "Room 12. It's not what it seems." Her voice lowered, and she seemed to glance over her shoulder before adding, "Trust me, if you start feeling strange, don't ignore it." I figured she was just messing with me. Still, those words stuck with me. In the following days, I heard more stories. Staff members who had worked in that room, even for just a shift or two, all had their own accounts. Flickering lights, objects moving when no one was around, whispers in the dark. One nurse swore she'd seen a figure in the corner of her eye, a shadow that wasn't hers. It sounded like the stuff of urban legends, but there was a part of me that began to wonder. One night, I stayed late to finish some paperwork. The hospital was quiet. No patients, no visitors. Just the hum of the fluorescent lights above. I was focused on my desk when I thought I heard something behind me. At first, I ignored it. But then, there it was again. A rustling sound, soft but unmistakable. I spun around, my heart in my throat. Nothing. Just the room exactly as I'd left it. The exam table, the cabinets. My breath was quick, and I tried to brush it off as my imagination. But then it happened again. A dragging sound. Something moving on the floor behind me. I jumped to my feet, my pulse racing. There was nothing there. The room was completely still. My eyes darted around, looking for anything that could explain the sound. But there was nothing. I checked the desk, my paperwork, my files. No cause for the noise. But the air had changed. It was thick now, heavy, like the room was pressing in on me. The sulfur smell returned, more pungent this time. I gagged, opened the window wide, but it didn't help. The cold remained. The whispers started then, faint, like a soft hum just out of reach. I hadn't been in the room long enough for it to feel this oppressive, yet I couldn't shake the sensation that something alive was there, breathing with me. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it, like a weight that never lifted. The next day, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. My body ached, my head throbbed, like I'd been awake for days. I was barely holding it together, and when I mentioned it to my supervisor, he just nodded, his face pale. "Room 12 has a history," he said, voice low. "It's always been that way. We've had a few nurses request transfers after working there for a while, just try to push through." But I couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, When I walked into the room, the sight that greeted me made my heart stop. The papers on my desk, neatly stacked only hours before, were scattered across the floor, as if someone had thrown them in a rage. I bent down to gather them, but when I touched one of the papers, a shock ran through my fingers, cold as ice. I pulled my hand back, the sensation still stinging in my fingertips. I felt nauseous. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, suffocating. I couldn't escape it. Every nerve in my body was on edge, and the room felt like it was closing in on me. I needed out, but I didn't know how to leave. I spoke to Ella again, my voice shaky, and she looked at me with understanding. "You're not the first," she said softly. "Everyone who's worked in there has felt it. The cold, the smell. It's like the room itself is trying to keep you." I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just stress, just exhaustion. But as the days passed, I couldn't fight the feeling any longer. I couldn't sleep. I had nightmares, visions of dark shapes, shadowy figures that moved around me, their cold fingers on my skin. My energy was being drained. It was like something was feeding on me, and I was powerless to stop it. I started to look worse. My colleagues noticed. I was pale, thinner than usual, and had dark bags under my eyes. I couldn't focus. My thoughts were foggy, and the exhaustion weighed on me. I couldn't bear it any longer. One evening, after yet another terrifying night, I went to my supervisor. "I need a transfer," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't question me. "Room 14, he said, his tone final. As soon as I left room 12, I felt the weight lift. The cold vanished. The nightmare stopped. The smell was gone. For the first time in weeks, I slept, and I woke up feeling normal. But the thing was, I couldn't forget room 12. A new nurse was assigned to it shortly after. I didn't warn her. I didn't want to seem crazy. It was her choice. A few months later, she requested a transfer too. Same as me. And the rumors? They persisted. Now, room 12 remains mostly empty. The staff knows, but no one talks about it openly. The hospital doesn't acknowledge the rumors, but we all know the truth. Something in that room isn't right. Something that doesn't belong there. And no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of being trapped in that room with something dark, something ancient. Every time I walk by room 12 now, I feel that chill run through me. I don't try to explain it anymore. I don't need to. Some things in this world are beyond understanding. Room 12 is one of them.